Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Big Game Hunters. I'm Mike.
And I'm Tom. Today we're going to review Ticket to Ride from Days of Wonder. But first, we have Chit Chat.
And today's Chit Chat, we're going to hopefully complete our three-part series on the breakdown. Look at something a little more detailed today. We're going to talk about interaction and independence and expandability and completeness. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the Chit Chat. Today, we're picking up where we left off last week in our ongoing series about the breakdown. Today, we're looking at expandability and completeness and interaction and independence. So when we say expandability for a game, when we're assigning an expandability score, what we're really talking about is how easy or natural it is for that game to be expanded, how we could add content to it.
Also, when you're talking about expandability, it could be editing a previous game. We mentioned in our previous expansions Chit Chat how sometimes you get an expansion that will modify the original game to like clear up rules content or make things flow simpler. So that can also increase the game's expandability.
Sure, or even to change balance. So it was, I think, Puzzle Fighter. It was definitely one of the Sterling games that he went back in the expansion and kind of changed some fighter abilities around because he perceived a little bit of an imbalance there. Or it could be if something is, it would have a low expandability score, I guess. No, I'm sorry, high expandability score if something is lacking content. So Tom Vassell, when he reviewed Battleship Galaxies, mentioned that there just wasn't quite enough in the box to give it a reasonable amount of replay value. He and I think, are both really waiting on an expansion because that game, it was good, but it's still sitting on my shelf.
That reminds me, we gave Seasons a moderately high expandability score because you mentioned in our discussion of that game that you wanted to see expansions for that game specifically. I have to say, when I think about that game, I don't really see it. I argued for the completeness side of that equation. I don't really see what's to expand about it. So from a perspective of someone who wants to see, the additional content for that game, what would a season expansion give us?
Sure. So with Seasons, I think it's an interesting game because we did give it a good completeness score, and I think it certainly deserves it because you could definitely keep playing it quite a bit out of the box. I certainly have. But I would love to see a Seasons expansion because at its heart, it's a drafting game. And so when you have a game like that, I would love to see an alternate set of 100 cards that you could mix and match with the original 100. I think that would really add a lot of replay value to it, and it wouldn't detract too much. On the other hand, it's a game that I've played so much, and I kind of enjoy the added layer when I play it with other veteran players of knowing the contents of the deck, of being able to look for specific things. So for instance, if I get a card that is really good at trading in cards for crystals, then I know there are certain other cards that will combo with it. If I don't see them in other players' tableaus, or if I didn't see them in the early initial draft, that's something I can look for. So Seasons, it's kind of a fence case for me. Sure. I'd like to see an expansion, but it doesn't really need one, and in some cases it would lose something with an expansion. What I really think, what kind of games really lend themselves to expansions are faction games. These are games where you have a single character or a single deck that you choose from a pool of them, and you play them against your opponent. Games like Summoner Wars, Mage Wars, Terra Mystica. Yeah, this is the game we have tons of chits for. Neuroshima Hex. Thank you, Tom. These are all games that expansions are very natural because they expand the number of options exponentially. Every time you add a new faction, you're adding a matchup with every previous faction. If it's a 2v2 game, I know that's how we like to play Epic Duels.
Yep.
Every time you have a new deck, then you add it even more because you also have the 2v2 structure then.
Speaking of Epic Duels, if we were to review that game, we'd probably give it a pretty high expandability score.
Certainly.
But I think that stems a lot from just the core game being rather simple, right? So when you want to see an expansion, you want to see new mechanics, a new interplay of how the game can work with itself, but you don't want to see repeats of the old cards and abilities and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I know we talked about a lot because, when we're on the forums, I was saying that I think an expansion kind of does need to push the game further. Anytime a game's getting an expansion, it can't just rehash what the first one did. I think Dominion's a great example of this. Base Dominion, very straightforward, not that much replay value, at least in my mind. When you throw in some of the expansions, you have cards that have an effect on the following turn. You have cards that are both a coin and an action card. it just really ups the amount of flexibility you have with the cards. So not only do you have more options, but in the case of Dominion, you have more interesting and compelling options. It just gives you cards with a lot more flair to them. So yeah, I definitely think it needs to up the mechanics, which can also definitely up the complexity.
Yeah. So is there anything else we need to say about expandability?
No, I think that about covers it.
We have a little bit more to say, but on the completeness side of the scale.
Right.
So we have a few times mentioned a games where they have expansions, but we haven't given the greatest expandability score. Tell us why.
So for a game like Ticket to Ride, which we'll be taking a look at today, spoiler alert for you breakdown fans, we are going to not give it a really high expandability rating, even though it has a lot of expansions actually published. With Ticket to Ride, it feels like a very complete experience right out of the box. And if I were playing that game in 2004 and had never known there were going to be expansions, I would have said, no, there's nothing new to add to this. It's complete as is. What could you possibly put into it? Days of Wonder, because it's been such a mega hit, has done new maps, but those don't really change the game much. With the new maps, some of them are better with a certain number of players than others, but for the most part, it's just more of the same. To me, that's kind of a weak way to expand a game. Also, you have, I think, expansions that can make the game worse in the experience.
Yes, I remember you telling us about this. Carcassonne, right?
Yep.
So
that's right.
I don't have a lot of experience with that one. Somehow I've avoided it. But just to give you a minute to breathe, I think the argument was that the expansions add mechanics that just don't enhance the game. Mm-hmm. Specifically, what were you talking about?
With Carcassonne, I don't feel like the extra tiles really change the game in an interesting way. But the big thing is they just lengthen the game so much. It's not a long game, but it's a slow game. And when you throw way more tiles in the bag, you just lengthen the game, and it really doesn't add much. Same with Battlestar Galactica. When you throw in the Pegasus expansion, the new characters and things are fine, but I don't want to go to the other ship or the other planet after I've already finished like a 4-hour game. So, yeah, I mean, I think sometimes expanding games isn't really going to help them. For games that are very complete, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we look for in a completeness in a game is probably just how well-rounded, like, not only is replayability part of it, but how full your experience is. So if you pretty early in discovering the game, just figure out the one aspect. So let's use seasons for example.
Sure.
If pretty early in discovering seasons you figure out all the card variables and how the mechanics can interact, and you've solved seasons, that would increase seasons expandability. For me, I think there's enough complexity there in seasons that that's why I would give it a higher rating, because there's just not enough, or there's too much, rather, math, if you will, for me to solve it.
Yeah.
So I guess that sort of leads into just how elegant maybe or clean a design is.
Yeah, definitely. When a design doesn't have too many extraneous elements, or a randomized deck, it's really hard to put new stuff in without forcing it. So when a game is like, any Reiner Knizia game is not going to get an expansion. With the exception of the Blue Moon card game, they all work in such a way that they're very simple, very clean. There's no real way to put new stuff into them. You would be forcing it. And I think that's, like I said, that's what some companies have done in terms of expanding things like Carcassonne and Ticket to Ride. Because they're such big sellers, they feel the need to, and even Settlers to some extent.
Yeah, a little bit.
So for independence, what do we really mean when we're talking about a game having a high level of independence?
When the players and their decisions don't really affect the other players at the table. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a game like a deck builder or a tableau builder, where you're basically just focused on your path to victory. Mm-hmm. That's about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anytime you're building an economic engine, it feels like you're doing it next to other players, not really in direct conflict with them. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a race rather than a boxing match.
Sure.
Is there anything about independent games that really grab you? Is there something that you feel really strongly about in terms of an independent game? Do you like independent games? I know you're more of a...
Yeah, I don't favor them. I do respect them because I think it's harder to get into an independent game, I guess. I feel very strongly there's just like a social level to games, and when a game has high independence, that social level is minimized. And the other aspect that I don't really like about independent games is you don't really know the game until you've played it a bunch of times.
Yeah.
And then only then can you start to optimize how you're building and going for things. So it takes several plays to get there. And unfortunately, because of the minimized social aspect, those several plays are going to be a little boring.
I think you mentioned when this came up the other night, when we were talking about tableau builders, the idea that they're kind of elite games.
Yeah.
And that's something that kind of appealed to you. Can you explain more about
Well,
what you
it's the same. That's the reason I respect them.
Okay.
I call them elite games mainly because...
do you feel like there's maybe a little more skill in independent games?
Yeah. A little skill, but also like gumption or a pride in your work, or however you want to call it.
Yeah.
But like it takes a certain mentality to pursue skill at that game.
Yeah.
That's why I call it an elite game.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I feel like when I'm sitting down to play a deck building game or a tableau building game, that everybody, if they're into it, are into it because they really enjoy quad gaming, not necessarily just sitting down to talk.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would kind of agree with that elite mentality, I guess. It's kind of an odd way to put it, but I like it. Now, to kind of move on, I guess, to interaction, what kind of games we think have a lot of interaction? What really defines...
the games we both love, Ameritrash games, have high interaction. Generally, party games have high interaction. Co-op games. Any game where you have a high level of player interaction, and that's like direct conflict things where you're like inflicting wounds on your opponent, or even if it's just like draining your opponent's resources, things like that.
Or I guess working together, like you mentioned with co-op games. Yeah. Or even, I just saw this reading other players. So, for instance, in trader games like Battlestar Galactica, a big part of the interaction is not in how you actually move about the ship, but it's just in how you're kind of looking around the table, kind of how you're evaluating other players' actions.
Interpreting their actions and gestures even.
Yeah. And it's definitely, like you said, a very much a quality of kind of Ameritrash games that you're not thinking about an economic engine, but in games where you're actually trying to beat the other player.
Yeah.
Or in games where you're trying to work together to achieve a shared goal.
I guess it's worth noting that I don't see highly interactive games as the reverse of highly independent games. I wouldn't say that they're lowbrow or lowest common denominator or something like that. Sure. I just see the others as, something on a shelf above.
I think it's worth noting that I think it's a little easier to get people into interactive games.
Oh, yeah.
I think interactive games tend to be more kind of gateway games, more kind of social party games, things that it's easier to get people to the table with. Whereas independent games, like I said, you really have to kind of have a gamer mentality already.
I think some of the strongest games, some of the games we probably agree about most, are the games that have both, but split those into two phases. So ones we reviewed so far are Pocket Battles and I can't remember the other, Mage Wars.
That's right.
So they have that beginning builder phase where you have to build your armor, you build your deck, whatever it is. And that's largely independent. You can think a little bit about what your opponent might be doing, but that's really just a cycle that, not a path worth chasing unless you know your opponent really well.
Right. I mean, I think those are some of my favorite games. The kind where you first, like Dungeon Command, where you first are building a squad, any TCG or LCG, where you are kind of independently building something and then you test it, and then you kind of put it out there. Galaxy Trucker. Something we both really enjoy. That is one where you kind of have an independent phase in the beginning, where you're just kind of grabbing pieces and throwing them on your spaceship, and then you're interacting a little bit with how you test the ships.
Even that phase sort of is interactive. It's an independent phase. You're only concerned about the chits you're grabbing, but there is sort of an interaction there because, like, for example, we had this one in a game we played where we were on opposite sides of the table and you were hoarding your pieces over here like a little miser, and I could not reach them because it was a wide table. That was an interactive element.
Sure, or when I was taking all of the crew cabins.
That too.
But I wanted to make sure
nobody else had it.
When I wanted to make sure that Tom could not put any people in with him. He really needed to just be exiled into space So yes, I agree that that is interactive, and I think that brings up a good point. Sometimes with games like that, you can have interactive elements that are kind of masked as independent elements.
Yeah, or the reverse with Galaxy Trucker.
Right. So with Galaxy Truck, you have something that's interactive that seems like you're doing it
No,
on
it's
your
independent.
own.
You're grabbing at your chits alone, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a little bit of interaction in it when you bump fists or you hoard chits or whatever, you know.
Sure. But I think what I'm trying to say is that one can kind of seem like the other. So you don't think of it necessarily as being interactive, but because you're grabbing from a common pool, it really is. That brings up Grimoire. Grimoire, it's, on one hand, it can seem like you're doing it independently when you first play it at first blush.
Doing what?
That's right. When you're playing Grimoire, it's a game where you're first selecting a spell that you'd like to play. It's a role selection game. And then the spells interact in various ways to give you benefits. So in Grimoire, it can seem like you're just choosing your spell in a vacuum, but as you play a little more, you can kind of see how other players' spells will very much affect yours.
Or by even judging their tableau in front of them, what the most optimal spell for them to choose would be.
Right, and then you can base yours on that. So that's kind of an element that kind of blurs the line a little bit.
Yeah, it can give a normally highly independent or highly interactive game a bump in the opposite end of the scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. So is there anything else we'd like to add about interaction or independence?
No, I think we've about covered it, and I think that about covers all the elements of our breakdown.
Yeah, so I think we haven't addressed every element by name, but I think the viewers should have a pretty good picture now of what we're talking about when we use these terms.
Right.
We covered a little bit of simplicity versus complexity and how to learn games, how we teach them. We covered expandability in 2 different ways now, so I think people should have a pretty good picture of what we're talking about. And if you don't, leave us a comment in the comment section below, and maybe we can clear it up. And now?
Now we are all set to do a tutorial for Ticket to Ride.
That's right. I'm going to show you to play. Join me over there. Now I'm going to teach you how to play Ticket to Ride. Ticket to Ride is a train game where players are trying to build routes across North America in order to score points. The player with the most points at the end of the game wins. Points are scored through building routes, completing destinations, and by having the longest train. The game ends when any player has 0, 1, or 2 trains left in his stockyard. At that point, the round is played out with that player having the final turn. Ticket to Ride looks great when it's set up and comes with a number of vibrant components. Each player will receive a lot of these train cars that he'll use to build routes. In addition, the game comes with a deck of route cards, which will always depict 2 cities and the number of points that the completed route is worth. In addition, if the route is not completed by the end of the game, the player who has the card will lose that number of points. The game includes 2 reference cards, one with the number of points each number of trains is worth, and the distribution of cards in the deck. The other is a reminder of how many points the longest route is worth. The game has a deck of 8 different colors of trains and locomotives. Each color is used to build a different kind of route on the map, and the locomotives can be used as any color. Finally, the game comes with a very large board and wooden score markers. These will move along the track as you score points. To set up a game of Ticket to Ride, first each player chooses a color. Then each player receives trains of his or her color and a score marker, which will be placed on the 0 space of the score track. Then each player is dealt 3 destination cards. Of these 3 destination cards, each player must keep at least 2 of them and may keep all 3 if he wishes. The cards not kept are placed on the bottom of the route deck. Then each player is dealt out 4 cards from the top of the trains deck. After that, the top 5 cards form a track along the side of the deck that players may draw from as they play the game. Every time you take a card from this track, one is immediately replaced. Now you know how to set up the game, it's time to learn how to play. Now that the game is all set up, it'll play out in a series of turns. On your turn, you may do one of 3 things. First, you can draw train cards. You can draw train cards either blindly from the top of the deck or from any available face-up in the track. You can draw 2 cards in total in any combination. When a card is drawn from the track, one is immediately pulled from the top of the deck to replace it. If you'd like to draw a locomotive face-up from the track, it counts as 2 cards. Therefore, you can never draw a card and then draw a face-up locomotive. Finally, if there are ever 3 locomotives in the track at once, all cards in the track are discarded and replaced by new cards. The second thing you can do on your turn is draw new destination cards. When you do so, you'll draw 3 cards from the top of the deck. You must keep at least one of them, but you may keep 2 or all 3. Anything you choose not to keep are placed face down on the bottom of the deck. Finally, you can use your trains to claim routes. When you claim a route, you must use train cards of the appropriate color. For instance, if I'd like to claim a 4-length lavender route, I must use 4 cards. The cards can be any combination of lavender cards and locomotive cards. When you claim a route, you immediately score points based on the length. You'll use this chart to determine how many points you score. When you score points, you'll move your marker up the track, and then your turn will end. The game is played out until any player has 0, 1, or 2 trains left in his stockyard, and then that will trigger the last round, with that player also having the last turn. Now you know how to play Ticket to Ride. Now that you know how to play Ticket to Ride, we're going to take a look at it in our point-counterpoint review.
Because Mike and I agree about this game, we're going to roll to see who argues for the game and who argues against it. If it's odd, he'll take the pros, and if it's even, I will.
It's odd, a destructive odd at best. So I'm going to tell you all what a great game Ticket to Ride is, how it's the best gateway game out there.
And I'm going to tell you to leave it on the shelf.
To begin with, if you don't destroy it with a series of die rolls, the game looks great once it's set up. When you're building your routes, and especially I like to have that moment at the end of the game, before people put it away, where you just step back and look how glorious it looks. I just really enjoy that about the game. It's a very tactile game. The pieces are nice. They're like nice plastic sculpts. The board is big and luxurious. You have the wooden score counters. Mm-hmm. Everything just feels really good in this game.
I can't disagree. It does look really great. Unfortunately, the design is a little lacking. It's all around the route cards. If you get a lucky deal on those route cards and all your routes connect right off the bat, you've got an easy run right to the end of the game. And the reverse can also be true. If you get a bad deal on the beginning route cards and they too immediately conjoin with another player, or they're just too far apart to connect, they can just destroy a game. There's just too much random in that route deck.
Yeah, and being able to just not keep some seems like it might be kind of a way to mitigate that. But I think in practice it ends up being kind of a false fix because
it does sort of mitigate the latter concern that your routes don't match up. It does that a little bit, but it does absolutely nothing for someone whose routes match up perfectly.
Yeah, and in a 4 or 5 player game, someone's routes are probably going to end up being a little more well laid out than yours. But it is a gateway game. You don't need to have a perfect kind of balance to it, because this is a great game to play with anybody. In fact, I'd say of the gateway games that I've played, this one holds up the best to repeated plays. I feel like this one has the most meat to it. I don't get bored with it easily. I feel like there's not an overwhelming amount of luck. I feel like I can, but at the same time, I feel like the strategy is simple enough that anybody can win. So I just think this one really works very, very well as an introductory game for new players or seasoned players alike.
That's also true. My second problem, though, once you get past the luck factor, is that even in the limited strategy that you've got, if you've got everyone on the board all playing optimally, as we like to say, you're going to reach that point where the game is decided. Now, you'll have to play several turns to finish the game, but you're going to reach that deciding point where if you block my track, I'm out. I can't connect my lines. I can't finish my routes. It's over for me. And that deciding point, one or more players are going to immediately lose, and one or maybe 2 players are going to be in competition for the victory. And that's just a hurdle. It's an annoying factor that the game is going to be over before the game is actually over.
Yeah, and I take it after that you kind of feel like a prisoner of the game.
Yeah.
If you're kind of pushed out. I can respect that, but the design is just so elegant that I can easily look past it. You have the double routes, which help with scaling. The double routes are for very often used sections of the map. And in a 2 or 3 player game, you don't use them, but in a 4 or 5, they activate, and it really kind of helps to allow you to compete at all levels. It helps with the scaling. And just using the different colored cards to build the routes really works well. Just a very streamlined design. The way they come out from the track, the way the locomotives, or as we like to say around here, the man trains work. I just feel like everything's really cleanly set up. There's no fluff on this game. There's a little bit of a weird rule with the locomotives that if 3 of them are out on the track, you wipe the track. Not 100% sure why that's in there. But other than that, it's a very streamlined game. Really great little gateway game. I always admire the elegance of it.
It is streamlined except for those jumpy parts that I previously mentioned. But as far as the production goes, it does look great. As you mentioned earlier, the one problem I would say I would have with the production would be this outside score marker. Because everyone's sitting around the table and everyone's constantly reaching across, not only are you fairly likely to bump these on the score tracker, you're also going to forget to do it. The more players you have, the more times you have to update this track. It just gets in the way, really.
Yeah, I can see that. I would say maybe at least half the games I play end up somebody forgets to, or maybe thinks he forgot to increase his score at some point.
Yeah.
And then the whole score track is useless. So everyone spends a little bit of time every turn tallying up those points, and then half the time it's not even an accurate measure, so you have to wipe the whole score track.
Yeah, you could either, if you were really fancy, make your own separate score tracker or write it down on a piece of paper, and that would solve the issue, but...
Even that, it's just hard to remember to score it, I think.
That's true.
But given the pros and cons, Tom, what do you think of the game on the whole?
Well, like you said, it is a great gateway game, so I think for that reason alone, I might pick it up. But it's going to get a lower than average score from me just because I wouldn't play it all that often. I'd probably only play it to introduce people who aren't serious gamers to gaming, or in a mixed crowd, things like that. So I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, that's understandable. It's a great gateway game. It's not something I'm going to pull out with my normal game group, so I do kind of agree with you on that one. I think I like it a little more, though. I'm going to give it a 7 on 10 because, for me, it stands the test of time. It's, for me, the top of the heap of gateway games. I've gotten kind of bored of Settlers and Carcassonne. They just have a little bit too, they feel like they have too much luck compared to this one, or they have other issues with them.
Sure.
In Settlers, I feel like it's over before it begins. But this one, I just feel like plays the best. It's the cleanest. This one does hold up for me of all the other gateway games.
Awesome. Well, get your ticket for the breakdown, because that's next. All aboard the breakdown for Ticket to Ride from Days of Wonder. You can consistently play this game in about an hour, no matter how many players you have, so we give it 65 short, 35 long. Ticket to Ride is locomotive fast at 80. The turns are short, but when your turn is over, you can feel like the caboose waiting at the station for everyone else to take their turn, so we give it 20 slow. And I promise that's the last of my train metaphors. We gave it 65 luck because you can get a good or bad group of routes in the beginning and because of the options you have when selecting your train cards, and 35 skill. We give it 65 strategy because most of the game you're working toward building your routes, and 35 tactics because of decisions around route blocking and when to select the magic rainbow train. 70 interaction and 30 independence. You're primarily concerned with building your routes, but other players can and do get in your way. We give it 20 immersion and 80 abstraction. The train theme does come through well, but the contest portion of it doesn't really. We give it 95 simplicity because it is an intuitive and simple design, very easy to learn. We give it 5 complexity because a few rules you have to remember from game to game. Portability 10 and grandeur 90. It's not all that large on the shelf, and it's a fair amount of table size, but it's really enticing to look at. We give it 20 expandability and 80 completeness. There are some expansions, but you don't really need them. Otherwise, it's a really clean and simple game. For our trophy scales, we give it 3 trophies and originality. It is an exemplary gateway game that everyone at the table, regardless of skill level, is going to enjoy. For value, we give it 3 trophies. It's a really popular game, but otherwise, it's not all that impressive in the box. But the price is fair. Mike gives it 7 out of 10, Tom gives it 6 out of 10, and that is the breakdown for Ticket to Ride.
We hope you enjoyed traveling with us today with Ticket to Ride. Next week in the Chit Chat, we're going to be talking about house rules. Rules that we introduce to slightly modify the game to our tastes. And we're going to be playing Grimoire, the role selection game from Z-Man Games.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel for weekly updates. See the links below for our Facebook and Twitter pages, and leave us a comment on your thoughts about the breakdown or gateway games.
See you next week. Words.